Hello and welcome to Homicide Hobbies. I'm Andy,
And I'm Claire.
and we're here to talk about some of the disturbing things that go on in the world, past and present. We feel like not knowing doesn't mean the crazy doesn't exist.
So we're going to scar you with the knowing.
Enjoy.
So I will disclose when I say something that I think is factual, but I have nothing factual to back it up. It's just my opinion based on nothing but my opinion. Just so you know.
All right. So
It'll
what do you
make
got for
sense
us?
as we go.
All right.
Okay. So today we're going to talk about the death of Private Felix Hall. Now, this case was recommended to us by one of our listeners, Miss Washington. Shout out to you.
Hey.
This case will take us into the 1940s and the segregated south of Fort Benning, Georgia.
Yikes.
And I'm just going to start this one out that the triggers are going to be, we will be discussing a dark period in U.S. history, just a lot of racial hostility, and it might make some people uncomfortable to listen to. I'm also going to say that a lot of the reports and everything that were in the FBI files, they specifically will say that somebody's colored or not. So that's not me, but it's just like there are definitely racial aspects to this case. So I hope it doesn't come across as offensive to anybody, but it is notated when they're talking to somebody who is colored or white.
That's messed up.
So we'll start out on March 28th, 1941. A platoon of engineers from the 20th Engineers Regiment at Fort Benning were running a field problem in an area just north of the 24th Infantry swimming pool. The area they were in is heavily wooded with dense underbrush and small ravines running irregularly throughout that area. So it's kind of hilly, hard to see too much ahead of you.
Okay.
Now, during their training exercise, they come across a maggot-covered body, which is later identified as Private Felix Hall.
Ew.
The body was hanging from a small sapling on the bank of a shallow ravine with just his head visible above the bank. The rope was tied around the victim's neck in a 1/4-inch noose that had dug into the flesh of his neck. Baling wire bound his feet and attached to a second rope which adjoined 3 other saplings, which strongly indicated that his feet had been tied by that rope, forcing him in a jackknife position. His hands were tied behind him. Felix was successful in kicking loose his legs and freeing his left hand. Then, while he still had breath, he desperately scraped dirt loose from the ravine wall, trying to scoop out enough earth to build up a mound beneath his feet that he'd be able to stand on. To take the strain from his neck, the FBI would later write in their report, he had gotten the dirt up enough to be at the arches of his dangling feet, but it was so soft and loose and ultimately not enough to support his weight. Now, initially, the public would be told that his death was possibly a suicide.
What?
But after his autopsy, it was ruled a homicide.
That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard.
It's so fucking stupid. How many trees can you... This case remains unsolved, and it's largely just... The case is fucked up. There's no way around it. And it calls into question if the government truly wanted to solve Private Hall's murder or not. I will say initially...
What's the time period in this one? Did you say that already?
Yeah, the 40s.
Oh.
His body was found March 28th, 1941.
It's horrible.
So that's the biggest issue with this case, is how much effort they actually gave to finding who did this to him. And again, it was unsolved. I have my theories. We'll get into those. But we'll give you a little bit about Felix. Now, he was born in 1922 in Millbrook, Alabama. His mother tragically dies of tuberculosis a week before he turned 3.
Oh.
Now, his dad moved to Montgomery to find work and left him and his 2 brothers to be raised by his grandmother. which Felix's grandmother, so his dad's mom.
Yeah.
Now, Felix would watch as he grew up. He had cousins that he grew up with that they would leave to join the military and train for war. Now, the only job available to a black teenager in Millbrook at that time was picking cotton. So basically, your options are you leave and you go into the military, or you leave and go somewhere else, or you pick cotton.
That's really fucked up.
Now, I think a lot of this case, you have to consider the times. So I do have little anecdotal things history-wise so you can gather what's going on. So what was going on in the 1930s and 40s hugely is the Great Depression. That is basically Felix's life. And until the start of World War II, that's when the Great Depression fizzled out. But the Great Depression affected everyone, but no group was hit harder than African Americans, who by the end of the 1930s, over half of them were unemployed. Now, whites were calling for all blacks to be fired as long as whites were out of work, which only put more racial tension and violence to become more common, which understandably, that's shit logic.
Yeah, it's stupid.
Now, this is also early on with access to public assistance, which provides substantially less to black families than whites. But even most charitable organizations denied African Americans entry to soup kitchens. And we're talking
What?
during the Great Depression. It's fucked up.
It really is.
So, schools, libraries, public transportation, restaurants, stores, parks, hospitals, and all other institutions and aspects of life were strictly segregated by law. So, that's what Felix grows up being. That's the norm.
It's disgusting.
I know I kind of get off on a segue here, but so in 1937, the Federal Housing Administration was created, known as the FHA, to allow for low interest mortgages available nationwide. However, they would claim the FHA would adopt discriminatory practices that would favor white applicants more than they would African Americans. But they'd also label African American communities as in decline and not suitable for underwriting. Now, from 1930 to 1950, less than 2% of FHA loans would be held by non-white buyers, essentially restricting their ability to live better or equal.
Yeah.
But they would also restrict white property owners from selling their home to an African American family by applying covenant restrictions. That's why I said this whole thing. I mean, I'm just trying to get you to understand the time period we're in and the kind of person Felix was, which I think makes this whole his case being unsolved that much more upsetting, because he didn't deserve to be treated the way nobody deserved to be treated the way they were at that point. But he definitely didn't deserve to let his death go unsolved.
Yeah. This is.
Now, when I was doing that digging, just the last thing on the whole housing thing that I thought was fucked up, the Alabama State Highway Director at the time was a high-level official of the Alabama KKK.
What?
Yes. He would deliberately approve the placement of state and federal highways and so that they would run through African American communities and divide them. That's enough about what's going on in Alabama. So around the world, April 9th, 1940, Germany simultaneously invaded Norway and occupied Denmark, and the war began in Western Europe. Now, by May 10th, German forces sweep through Belgium and the Netherlands in what's become known as Blitzkrieg, or the Lightning War. Which brings us to August 1940. Felix leaves his home in Millbrook, Alabama. He's just 18 to join the army and prepare for World War II. Now, this is a month before the draft is conscripted, and I think, knowing how the United States was treating African Americans, I think it's crazy to think he voluntarily wanted to go
Defend a
and
country that does not support
his
him.
well-being.
Or
Yes.
yeah,
So I just think that says a lot about him.
it's a lot about his character.
Now, at 18 years old, he's 5'8" and weighs 130 pounds. Now,
Typical
Felix,
teenage boy.
yeah. So Felix is assigned to the 24th Infantry Regiment in E Company, one of the first all-black military units. Now, instead of fighting in the Pacific with the rest of his regime, he would instead be found bound by his hands and ankles by baling wire and lynched in the ravine of the Chattahoochee River. Now, this is the only murder on a military installation of this kind.
Like ever?
Yet typically people aren't lynched on post.
Yeah, but like ever? Not saying that there should be lynchings on post. I'm like, this is the only one
Of
because
its
granted,
kind on a military installation, correct.
That's crazy.
So I think the mentality would be the military. I would, the way I see it is, I think soldiers are held at a higher standard. They're supposed to be disciplined. They're not supposed to be doing this type of shit, let alone to a fellow soldier. That's somebody you're supposed to be trusting going to war, not somebody who's also your enemy.
That's crazy.
Mm-hmm. Now, like I said, he voluntarily goes into the military before the draft. The draft was conscripted a month later, September 16th, 1940, and required all men 18 to 45 to register for the draft, which began officially in October that same year. Now, if drafted, a man served on active duty 12 months and then in a reserve component for 10 years or until he reached the age of 45, whichever came first.
Jeez. I didn't know that.
I didn't either. That's why I was like, huh, okay.
I didn't know once they signed up, they were roped in for 10 years.
I didn't either.
What happens? No. So even, sorry, but even if they hit like, okay, let's say they're 18, serve 12 months, they can get called up for 10 years.
Yep. As 10 years as a reserve.
So can they extend that? Like even
I'm getting there.
Okay.
So only 900,000 would be in training at one time is also like, that's how not everybody got drafted all at once. So
right, because that would be a shitstorm of chaos.
Yeah, so they didn't want to fall below a certain number, and 900,000 is how many would be training at one time.
That's still a lot.
Now, by the summer of 1941, President Franklin Roosevelt would request the draft time be extended from 12 months to 30 months for national security reasons. It was passed with a single vote. Now, mind you, that's during wartime, so it's one of those, you're not going to go through the effort of training people and then let them go from if you need them. So that was why that was passed. And naturally, the people who are serving their 12 months are going to be pissed because they thought after 12 months, they're done.
Yeah.
So they would begin writing Ohio on barrack walls and protests, which stood for Over the Hill in October, which meant that when they were going to leave after their 12 months were up, that's what they were going to do. Now, there were deserters, but it wasn't widespread. But just to give you an idea of the turmoil or the people in the military at this point, not everybody wanted to be there. But Felix, on the other hand, he wanted to do his part. He wasn't a draftee.
Go Felix.
So that will bring us back to now that we're caught up on March 28th, 1941, when they find Felix. Now, since his murder happens on a federal installation, it is reported to the FBI that they found a body hanging on Fort Benning during that field exercise.
I feel like you should have put in the trigger warnings that it was a history lesson. Sorry.
Fuck you. Again, I find it interesting, but also what he was growing up in it's a dark period of history. And I kind of did say we're going through history. So the scene was sifted for evidence and his body thoroughly examined. No physical evidence was ever developed. So when they come across his body, It's partially decomposed with that 1/4-inch rope, roughly 4 feet long, tied with a slip knot around his neck. The rope cut deeply into his neck. The soft tissue of the mouth and nose had been destroyed by insects and birds. His
Ew.
tongue protruded from his mouth. There was a small hole on his left shoulder, but didn't extend beyond the muscle, and then a second hole in his deltoid muscle that was very superficial. Now, they said these holes weren't
Holes.
connected. I'm not sure. It would seem like probably an animal did it, but just to give you an idea of why it took some time to identify him. The skin of his entire body was loose, his belly distended, and a large portion of his skin had peeled away from the body. Maggots and insects were over him entirely.
Okay, so also in your trigger warnings, detailed descriptions of the corpse, because thanks.
Yeah. Now, they did x-ray his chest, skull, and ribs, but it didn't show any fractures or injuries. His hands, like I said, had been tied together, but his left hand was in front of his abdomen and his right hand behind his back, and then his feet were bound with the baling wire. Now, it was determined the way Private Hall's body was positioned and the location that no one man could have committed the murder. Now, it's later Felix's first sergeant is the first one to identify his body by the shoes that were found with him. It was a civilian type slipper, stating that he was the only person he ever saw wear that type of shoe. Now, I'm going to tell you, when I read that one, I have to say that I was like, I hope I don't have some fugly ass shoes that somebody's like, that's her. I don't want to be identified by any of my clothing that somebody might be like, that ugly shit I have never seen anyone else have. I was really thinking of your sandals.
Shut up, Claire. I wear them around the house because they're easy to slide my feet into.
But because of the state he was in, that's like you really couldn't tell who he was.
Well, for his skin to be loose like that, how long was he missing for?
We're getting there.
But I feel like it should have been fairly easy to identify him in the sense that if you have someone that's missing, I realize some people went AWOL, but still, I feel like that list should have been pretty narrow.
So it took several days of letting Felix's hands sit in a saline solution in order to get fingerprints off of him. Now, after several days of soaking, the skin was so tough that they had to peel his fingers off
Ew.
and place them in a bottle of glycerin. Now, they were able to compare fingerprints and positively identify Felix based on the fingerprint of his right hand.
You definitely need to add your trigger.
But I'm not gonna lie, when I read that, I was like, ugh.
And it didn't dawn on you to mention that in your trigger warnings. It's disgusting. Like, I feel sorry for this guy. This should not have happened to him. But also, when you have a detailed description of a corpse,
Sorry.
you need to give me a heads up. Like,
Sorry.
ew.
Now, it was determined that Private Felix Hall was last seen on February 12th, 1941, around 4 p.m. By soldiers he worked with at the sawmill when they all left for the day. They parted ways, and as he told them, as they were like turning off, that he's going to head to the post exchange or the PX as they were headed to the barracks. Now, he would never make it to the PX, which makes it from February about 6 weeks that he was in the woods.
What?
Yep. Now, mind you,
did they write him up as being like AWOL? They just thought he took off?
Am I talking slow? Because that's literally my next section. Although Felix was missing from work as of February 13th, he was not reported as a deserter until March 10th. Now, he was listed as AWOL, and bear in mind, prior to this, he had a perfect attendance record.
Okay, so I get that people might change their minds, but when you had somebody that voluntarily signed up that has perfect attendance and they go missing in any aspect of life, like
that's what I did with the whole, okay, so up until this point, it would seem like he very much wanted the military life, and there's no records of anyone going to look for him when he failed to show up for work. They just jotted it down. He's AWOL. Now, Dave, I was picking his brain during all this because when I was reading part of the FBI stuff, some of it was like, what the hell does that mean? But I was horrified to know he wasn't even reported as a deserter until March. But Dave said you have to be AWOL for a certain amount of time before you're listed as a deserter. So I was like, okay, fine, whatever.
Well, ask Dave, unless you already did. What's like if you go AWOL for
I
2
believe
weeks and then show back up? What's like what kind of
ramifications.
is there like a disciplinary action that takes place, or are they just like, oh, glad you're back?
No, they're not glad you're back. You probably go to jail.
Even though you came back?
I've heard of people who, when they come back, yes, because you were gone. So, I mean, you can go to the prison jail or get whatever disciplinary action or what. You can't just disappear.
Okay.
But
I was just curious.
I just thought it was crazy that friends, chain of command, nobody just goes to like his barracks or tries to figure out what. I mean, I get during this chunk, there are people who are deserting.
That was
So
going to be my next question was
I
like,
don't-
what
Yeah.
what was the rate in which people were strolling out and saying, I'm done?
So that's why I was saying that compared to nowadays, that it's not wartime. There's not a draft going on. It's not a commonplace of people just not showing up. So I realized that's what I'm comparing it to. So I guess at that point, they're just doing the whole, if people are beating feet, they'll turn up eventually, then they'll deal with them. But they've got so much to be focused on. They don't have time to chase down somebody who doesn't want to be there. Is a shitty way. But again, I still say he had a perfect record up until then. He should have at least, somebody should have been curious where he was. He could have been dead in his barracks room for all they know. But
well, in the barracks, don't they share barracks?
Yeah.
So I'm guessing his roommates were like, well, he hasn't been here.
Yeah. But again, there's no record of anybody doing any sort of footwork to see where he is.
Yeah.
Now, as of May 21st, 1941, evidence, so they send out everything to be tested at the lab, the FBI, that is. The report comes back that determines the binding wire was a common steel wire, and establishing origin of it was not possible because it could have come from a plethora of places on post. Same with the rope. Now, no human hairs were found, but one specimen, a white hair, was consistent with goat hair, but also possessed characteristics of rodent hair. Now, it was pointed out that at that time, this hair was commonly used for felt hats, which Dave thought, he was curious if it was like, could have been a drill sergeant's hat, a cavalry hat of that time. I don't know. Although it was a white hair, so.
He was found in the woods, right?
Yes.
Is it possible that it came from like a possum?
That's the other, like, other than it's an animal hair, nothing comes of it.
Well, and his body has been picked over by critters, so.
Well, it was found on the brim of his hat, Felix's hat.
Yeah.
Now, in addition to the animal hairs, there were also groups of vegetable fibers, which I don't know. I realized I was trying to read a report and make sense of it, but I was thinking hay. Like, keep in mind, around the times, there were a lot of horses, the stables on post, all of that. So with animal fibers, it just said vegetable fibers. But mind you, all of that, nothing comes of it because it's all so common that it doesn't lead to anything. It doesn't narrow down who could have been over there. Now, it's also noted in this report that the officers that went for the provost marshal's office after cutting down Felix, they removed his clothing and the rope and then washed them all by spraying them with water from the hose.
What?
To which I was like, they did what?
What about all the evidence and stuff that they could have?
Now, exactly. Now, the officers state they took these actions because the smell coming from the clothes and the ropes were unbearable.
Okay, but this poor man was murdered.
Now,
and deserves to have his.
this is just me outside looking in, but I think the fact that lynchings taking place in the South happen all too often, and I think if it were white soldiers that stumbled upon it or white officers, I think it's possible they were trying to cover up somebody else's shit and hosed it off. I know it had to have stunk and they had to have been able to, if they brought them inside kind of thing, that would be a smell
So
to
I
deal with.
agree.
But I think the possibility is out there that a fellow racist was trying to help somebody out.
Well, a couple things on that. If it took multiple people to do this to him, I'm gonna go with, is it possible that it was a KKK type thing? I know they were all in the military, but
Yeah, but you figure the head person for the
yeah, exactly. So they could have killed
yeah.
him. But at the same time, on the other side of things, was it soldiers in doing the investigation, or was it the FBI that washed it off
So the FBI wasn't there when they
yet?
pulled him out of the woods, so it was the provost marshal's
Oh,
office.
gotcha. So is it possible, since this doesn't happen ever on base also, that they just, like when you
So
have like this small town
yeah,
murder, you have like very um
inexperienced.
inexperienced investigators, they just didn't handle it right. I'm not going to say that it's not possible that it was like a whole conspiracy thing, because I think with
There's a
his long
possibility.
history it's 100% possible that that is the way it went down. But
So Dave had the same thoughts, is that it could be a case of this is the only lynching to take place on a military installation, so they're not used to processing a body and they can't exactly leave him there until the FBI gets there. So they were just trying to do their best. And I get he's covered in bugs and maggots and it's disgusting. But you have to, I mean, what evidence got washed away? I don't know.
yeah, that, and there wasn't a lot of DNA
Yeah, but
technology at that
hairs,
point.
or who's to say that there was or wasn't anything? But
Well, they had to have done it to an extent and collected evidence, because if they found the hair on the brim of his hat, they did get that. So they
well,
had to have collected evidence to a certain point,
I
and then they
feel
were
like,
probably just like, okay, this is just a mess of a crime scene. Let's just wash it off.
but I feel like the brim of his hat is where it was found, and he probably wasn't still wearing his hat. So they probably didn't have to hose that off because it wasn't on him. So the smell,
Yeah.
but regardless, that occurred. Now, several Signal Corps wagons were also parked around Fort Benning, which allowed access to the ropes that were similar to those used on Private Hall. Now, the provost marshal for Fort Benning, the name was redacted, stated that when the used rope became frayed, it was simply cut off and thrown away, making the fact of it being a Signal Corps rope impossible to narrow down suspects because it was widely available to the over 50,000 soldiers on post.
Oh gosh, that's a suspect pool.
Yeah, so it's just one of those, okay, well, what was used doesn't help anything. So, May 14th, 1941, Alan Cloud, a prisoner, is interviewed concerning Felix, but states he knows no one by that name or anything regarding his death. But also stated he was under guard during that time anyway, so he couldn't have anything to do with his death. Now, he's on the FBI's radar because of comments he had made about wanting to kill or having killed a black man. Now, the story went on. He was working under guard over some black soldiers, and a black soldier was driving a fertilizer wagon and refused to dump the fertilizer where it should have been. Now, the man talked back to him, and then called for a guard to enforce compliance of the soldier who wasn't listening. The black soldier, who Cloud can't recall his name, began talking back to the guard that was called over, who then unbuttoned the flap to his pistol before the black soldier would follow instruction. So that's why they start with that guy, because that was also where Felix worked.
Huh.
Now, I thought it was
it
interesting.
Felix?
Well, I find it interesting because this guy is like, he says he's never heard of anybody that name, but This interaction, he doesn't even know the name of the guy that confrontation happened with. So how does he know it wasn't Felix? But I also feel like when we get through some of this, there's a lot of people who do I don't know. I don't know
And
anything.
I'm gonna guess that it probably didn't play out like that. I think that your Alan Cloud guy was probably being a dick, and whichever guy was like, it doesn't go there, versus,
Yeah.
you know what I mean? Like, I don't think it
Now,
played out like that.
now during this interview, Cloud would make a remark that if a colored man behaved that way in Louisiana, he would have been killed. Now, Cloud would say that Sergeant Cootie, which that was Sergeant
Sorry.
Cootie was in charge of the guards at the incinerator and would frequently talk about wanting to kill a black man. So I think the fact that all of these racist fucks that don't bother to know the name of their fellow workers
Coworkers, yeah.
because of their color is disgusting. But so a lot of them will be like, I didn't know what his name was because they didn't give a shit enough to know his name.
That's awful. People are scum, you know?
Now, just to let you know, the Cloud guy, his records do show that he was confined during Felix's murder for assaulting one of the guards. Now, it was observed that the guards were all afraid of Cloud and would watch him closely went during the FBI's interview. So apparently, this guy's just a piece of shit. That's in May, right? So in June, the NAACP start a National Defense Day and protest discriminating African Americans and government hiring. Now, labor leader Philip Randolph called for 100,000 African Americans to march on Washington to protest discrimination in the armed forces and in the defense industry. In response, Roosevelt signs an executive order forbidding racial discrimination in government hiring and training programs to avoid escalation during this time. Now, the order set up the Fair Employment Practice Committee. It was the first federal action that, although it's not a law, it was the first step towards promoting equal opportunity and prohibiting employment discrimination in the United States.
Well, that's all fine and dandy. You can't, like, when you have pieces of shit like Cloud and like Mr. Cooties,
it's not going to happen overnight.
Right. Well, you need to get rid of those people.
Dude, then you'd say goodbye to the South. Like, just
goodbye to the South.
Well, I'm just saying, like, it's so deeply embedded at this point that it just it was hard to read.
Hell of a battle, yeah.
So, in a letter written in June 1941, Major General L.R. Ferdinand, then Fort Benning's commander, said Hall's death was believed to be a sex murder, and that and that had been greatly exaggerated by communists and other organizations. Now, this guy does not explain.
A sex murder?
Thank you. He does not explain what a sex murder is in his letter. But it's just like, what? I still don't know.
He was getting kinky and died? Because I would highly disagree with that.
I have no earthly idea what
or it was a sexually
means.
motivated murder. Maybe they're trying to say that this guy was sleeping with somebody's wife or something.
We'll get there. Don't get ahead of the story. But his letter goes on to say colored soldiers receive exactly the same treatment here as whites. Private Hall's death is believed to be a sex murder rather than the result of any race feelings. And I was like, wait, what?
He's racist. He's just trying to keep, you know what? He might not
be
racist.
He threw in communists. Like, that was like a, what?
He might not be racist, but he's trying just to keep things as calm and civil as possible. But
I feel like it was all probably him, and I don't know this for a fact, but it was probably him that said it was a suicide. Because it's just like, what? What? You're really grasping at straws here. Yeah. Now, regardless of the region, all of the bases, there would be separate blood banks, hospitals or wards, medical staff, barracks, recreational facilities, for black soldiers. And white soldiers and local white residents routinely slurred and harassed them. So to say that they were treated equally or had the same treatment, no, they weren't. No, they weren't.
No,
Are you blind or just fucking stupid? Where are you? Now, by July 8th, 1941, Sergeant Green and Sergeant Hodge are named as the FBI's most likely suspects. We're going to get into why. So, Felix was last seen near Sergeant Hodge's home, which was adjacent to the Green's home. Now, one theory being that Hodges and Green were tired of the peeping Toms that were coming around their neighborhood and grabbed
on
Felix.
base?
Yes, and grabbed Felix when he walked through. Now, Sergeant Hodge is named as a potential suspect, but huge chunks are redacted from the FBI's investigation as to why he's believed to have motivation to kill Felix. Like a whole paragraph is missing of they believe he has motive because, and then they just chunk it out. The investigation, the investigation goes as far as when Hodge moves out of his on-post home, they find rope left in his garage and send it to their lab to see if it matches the one used to hang Felix. And I will say it does not match, but they think he has motive enough to do that.
Well, what's the point in testing it if everybody had access to the same kind of rope?
I don't know, but they did.
I feel like that was just a waste of time just to make it look like they were doing more than they were actually doing.
I do feel like that's the case in some of this. Now, Sergeant Green is described as 5'10" and 190 pounds with an 8th grade education. His wife was named Amy. Now, interesting side note, it wasn't until 1972 that voluntary enlistment required a high school diploma, and not until 1996 that a diploma, a GED, and being felony free was a requirement. Just so you know.
Well,
but so
that definitely weeded out a lot of the pieces of shit that were in there.
Well, so that just gives you the idea of some of these people, they don't have great education anyway. So I think education and being an arrogant piece of shit kind of go hand in hand a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
But also that Sergeant Green is almost double the weight of Felix. So to be able to toss somebody around like that. Private Hall worked at the sawmill, and in order to get to his barracks after work, he would cut through Block W, which was the shortest distance from home to where he slept. Now, Block W happened to be a housing area occupied by white non-commissioned officers. Now, prior to Private Hall's disappearance, this area had a number of reports of peeping Toms that had been turned into the provost marshal, which is the post-military police, if you haven't figured that one out. Now, no reports were made after his disappearance, which I find interesting because if he was in the woods for 6 weeks, the odds are that was who people were reporting seeing. Now, I'm not to say that he was a peeping Tom. I think it could have gone the route of there's a lot of racists. He's walking through a white neighborhood and they're just saying he's peeping because they don't like that he's there. Not saying he is or he wasn't, but if he was, he's 18 and was being very nosy. But I think the odds are greater that it's a bunch of white military wives that don't like that he's there.
Yeah.
But anyway, so they interview Miss Thompson, a resident in Block W, and she told the FBI investigators that Sergeant Henry Green had been having issues with a black man peeping in his windows. Miss Thompson stated on several occasions that she would see him sitting outside his house at night with a gun to try to catch the peeping Tom that would come around. She would also say that she had heard that he had shot at one black man and that he had suspected of loitering around his house. Now, Miss Green...
Wait. He shot at a black man that he suspected was loitering?
Yeah.
What? How is that legal?
You thought the 70s were bad. The 40s were way worse.
Sounds like it.
Now, Miss Green, Sergeant Green's wife, was suspected of being little better than a prostitute and very loose with her favors, but she had never been
That's not what I thought you were going to say she was loose with.
Well, that is what in the FBI report, very loose with her favors, and I think it's
Jeez.
exactly what you're thinking. But she had never been seen with a black man. Now, by this point, what I'm thinking is if she's carrying on around, it's possible the peeping toms are sniffing around because she's like the slutty lady on post.
Ew, they're sniffing around, really? That's your wording of choice? Sniffing?
Okay, so Sergeant Green has a
Jeez,
poor
Claire.
reputation. He'd been found previously to have been bootlegging whiskey, and he was known to be a heavy drinker, and he had ties.
His wife's a whore. Yeah, no wonder he's a heavy drinker.
But he has, I mean, people describe him as being quarrelsome and disagreeable.
Again, his wife is a whore. No one, and everybody knows it.
Well, the fact that the neighbor was like, she's no better than a prostitute, or I'm sorry, little better than a prostitute. I was like, dang.
Because it's free?
I don't know. Now, Sergeant Allison, Sergeant Ace Allison married the sister of Sergeant Green's wife. Allison is 5'11" and 184 pounds, so still a bigger dude. Now, this is important because at this point, he's living at the Greens' house. So you've got both of those dudes in the same house. And then the neighbor across the street is where it was near where Felix went missing.
Is the sister living there with the two dudes and the whore?
Yep.
Okay. Is she a whore too?
It's her sister, so I feel like, I mean, it is Alabama also, so they could have been keeping it in the family. I don't know. We're not going there, pervert. But
I was just trying to wrap my head around if this was becoming like a brothel on base.
Yeah, I don't know. They weren't charging, so now Sergeant Allison was interviewed by FBI and denied participating in Felix's murder. But during that interview, Sergeant Green was part of the 501 Parachute Battalion that was stationed at the Panama Canal Zone. So between the time that Felix was murdered and the FBI's like interviewing people, he was sent to the Panama Canal.
I didn't know that was a thing, but okay.
It's during war times or near war times. But during Felix's disappearance, Miss Green was in the hospital due to injuries sustained during a car accident.
I thought you were going to say during one of her trysts.
No, so I think it's possible that Miss Green wasn't in a car accident, and since she has a nasty, just a piece of shit husband, I think it's possible that he smacked her around, possibly for being a dirty whore. Not saying she deserved it, but I'm just saying it's the 40s. That's what they did. Not being a dirty whore, but the slapping around your wife. I also think it's possible that maybe she was having a relationship with Felix and he wasn't a peeping Tom, but they don't have cell phones during then. So how was he supposed to know if she just goes missing for a few days of what happened to her? So I think it's possible he went looking for the girlfriend that he had been meeting up with and she didn't show up. So he peeped in the window at the wrong time. Because how is he supposed to know when it's safe? When's the all clear?
Well, and let's face it, it's very possible she wasn't sleeping around. She was caught having an affair with a black man, and that's what made them call her a whore. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Well, I think if considering the times, like, it definitely would have been some shit people would have said if they saw her with a black dude.
Yeah, and then because their neighbors, friends, relatives, whatever, finding out about this affair, they're referencing her as a whore because they don't approve of her actions. Her husband's beating the crap out of her, and he has no idea what's going on, so he's still poking around.
Yeah, so that's what my theory was. That
well, now I feel bad calling her a whore.
Well, she is a whore. We'll get there, but that's where I was just like, that could have been a case of when people saw him peeping around, they can see across the street and see him going around. And then again, that if she's in the hospital, maybe they missed a meeting up thing and he just was concerned. And he knows that Green has a temper, so he was worried for her. And that on that day, perhaps since he was home and maybe he doesn't know that his brother-in-law is also there, and they drag him off into the woods, which, by the way, I've got a map of where this house is, where Felix was, where his barracks. It's like right in the middle. So I think it's possible. Now,
So it was Mr. Green in the woods with a rope.
this isn't a clue, Andrea.
It kind of is. It's unsolved.
Now, they did interview Sergeant Allison, mainly because he was living with Green at the time, but also because it was reported that he had stated shortly after Felix's body was found that Sergeant Green would have to be mighty good to his wife from now on, as she could kick the bucket out from under him at any time with the information she now had on him. So I was just like, yeah. And I also think it's weird that prior to him disappearing, there were people saying there was a peeping Tom in the neighborhood, but after he went missing, nobody saw a peeping Tom for 6 weeks. That tells me that was probably Felix, because nobody knew he was murdered during that 6 weeks. So I do think that either he was peeping in windows, or again, that he was in a white neighborhood and they were just saying he was peeping when he wasn't.
Or the neighbors, since it's a white neighborhood, helped the husband get rid of Felix.
Yeah. So on the last day Felix was seen alive, it was a Wednesday. Now, both Sergeant Allison and Sergeant Green were off duty that day and spent the afternoon drinking together, which makes it possible to think.
Could you try again?
Are you fucking serious right now?
I won't respond to that.
Me either.
Shut up, Siri. How do you get her to go away? She's such a nosy bitch.
Do I have to cut that out? Because I feel like that's kind of funny.
I don't even know where it was. Okay. So it's possible to think that one theory is that Private Hall was making his normal trek through Block W when he was taken by the two sergeants who had been drinking and dragged into the woods where he was murdered. Now, when they were going through Felix's belongings in his barracks, they found 2 notebooks that belonged to him, most of which they say is illegible handwriting, but some of which they could make out were phone numbers and addresses of girls that Felix had been interested in. Now, I think it's just a normal teenage boy. He liked the ladies.
Well, was Miss Green in there?
Oh, hold up. So they've got Florence Cotton with her complete address. I'm not reading it out because who gives a shit, but her complete address. Then we've got Cordelia Huff, her complete address. S.E. May Washington, a partial address. And then we've got Amy May with a notation of BW9388, which they were speculating perhaps means Block W on Fort Benning, and Sergeant Green's wife is named Amy. There's no last name for this gal.
Huh. I thought it said Amy May.
Could be a middle name. Or maybe he nicknamed her Amy May. Anyway, Ephraim Rogers, a colored anti-tank soldier.
Wait. Total ADD. But do any of those other women's addresses cut through that Block W?
They don't. They're all Montgomery. And the one that doesn't have an address, just a BW9388, that's all that's next to her name.
Was 9388 or whatever it is, was that their house number?
I don't know. I don't think so. But I don't know what the 9388 means.
Okay.
But it's interesting. Now, Ephraim Rogers is a colored anti-tank soldier who was part of the 24th Infantry with Felix. Stated he was going to his barracks when he fell in step with another colored soldier whose name he doesn't know, that told him when he was working a detail, another soldier had said he knew who killed Felix and would tell if he could get relieved from his duty at the guardhouse. Now, with the assistance of this assistant provost marshal, all the people in the prison stockade and the guards were interviewed in order to locate if somebody knew who killed Felix. They interviewed 26 people in total who denied that they made a statement to anybody or had any knowledge about who killed Felix, but each one of them promised to cooperate should they become aware of information. Which I'm like, I feel like, again, the racial aspect and tension in this case, I feel like even if people knew something, they also knew if they said anything, they could end up like Felix.
Yeah. There's no incentive to say anything.
No. So, May 20th, 1941, this is just a side note, 3 soldiers of the 62nd Air Base Headquarters Squadron, who were all white, were arrested after stopping a group of colored soldiers only a short distance from where Felix was found. They were driving in a car when they passed the 24th Infantry quarters. They claimed, the white soldiers that is, one or more of the colored soldiers made some derogatory remark at them. So they stopped the car, got out, and when the colored soldiers approached them, one of the white soldiers pulled a revolver and threatened them with a gun, verbally abused them, and threatened to kill them all. Now, one of the color soldiers they forced to grovel and beg for his life. All the names were redacted, and nothing came of this investigation to link to Felix. But it's just like, that was happening on post.
Yeah, the racial tension was extremely high.
So, again, you're thinking the post commander is saying everybody's treated equally. Okay. Now, when considering the facts of the case, the subject or subjects took a great deal of risk to hang Felix rather than beat him up, shoot him, knife him, beat him to death. So the fact that the subjects were determined to see him die by hanging, they think suggests and signify that a Southerner would have handled a colored person that way, and that's who they're kind of looking for.
Mm.
Now, it was thought possible that Felix had come in contact with a white woman in one of the non-commissioned officers' areas, or secondly, that he was the peeping Tom and was caught in the act, or thirdly, that he had some difficulty with one of the white men at the sawmill that he worked with. Now, in regards to the first theory, that Felix was in contact with some white woman, Willie Weaver, a fellow soldier of the 24th Infantry, stated that he and several other soldiers were sitting around talking in a tent about different girls in Alabama when Felix spoke up about meeting with a white lady nearly every night behind the cook and bakery school near the railroad back of Block 12, which was a white non-commissioned officer's residence area.
Is that where Amy?
I don't know. Now, Willie said he thought that Felix might have stated she was a married lady and that she was very good looking. He just can't recall. And no one else in that unit or the tent that would have been in there recall hearing Felix. But that's man memory.
I realize that it's possible it could have been like one of the officer's daughters, but women weren't in the military at that point, so she's either somebody's wife or somebody's daughter. So,
well, they did have civilians on post that were female because they had maids.
Gotcha.
Now, in regards to the second theory that he had been caught as a peeping Tom, now the provost marshal's office would say they didn't have official reports of the peeping Tom, but they were rumors that reached the office, but it was like a so-and-so heard of so-and-so. So they didn't have like an official report or dates or times. They just knew that that area was supposedly having a peeping Tom issue. Now, and the community next to this one on post, the Bradley area, another white non-commissioned officer housing area, a white woman was attempted to be raped by a black man. So it was thought that this being recent enough to cause concern in Block W, that perhaps Felix was found walking through the neighborhood and assumed to be that man.
But again, I question what, no offense to, and I'm not victim shaming or anything like that, but is it possible that the woman that was claiming to have been raped or nearly raped was really caught having an affair with a black man and then lied to excuse the affair?
Anything's possible. I also think it's possible if that legitimately happened, that why people, the menfolk, were wanting to deal with the supposed peeping Tom themselves, because they're thinking happy. Yeah, they're thinking they're saving the day of getting rid of the world of a rapist. And let's face it, they're not thinking too highly of the colored folks anyhow, so what do they care? Is the mentality I'm getting from this anyway. So that's the other theory, is that Felix was just wrong place, wrong time. The provost marshal reached out to the wives of Block W while their husbands were on duty in order to question them discreetly about the peeping Tom. I think he wanted to find out if anybody was going to fess up to sleeping with Felix, or to find out if they'd heard anything.
Yeah.
Now, that doesn't come of anything. Everybody doesn't know anything, but that seems to be consistent throughout this report. Now, in regards to the third theory, that Felix could have had an altercation with one of his bosses at the sawmill. Now, several people will recall hearing that Felix had had a serious argument with a civilian at the sawmill and was ordered to not come back to work by his white boss. But he did return that day, which was the day before he disappeared.
Not to sound stupid, but how do you get fired from a military job?
Well, that's kind of, we'll get there, because that's why Felix goes back, because he's like, that's where he's, so that's his job, is over there. The civilian can't fire him and tell him not to come back. Now, Sam Johnson and George Yates, both white straw bosses, denied knowing anything that could help the case and stated that Felix was not a good worker. Now, Private Willie Smith also worked with Felix and said that Felix had told him that he had gotten in an argument with a white man, and he was threatened to hit him, whereupon Felix picked up a cant hook that is used to move logs, drew it back.
What?
A cant hook is used to pick up logs or move logs. It looks like a claw.
Huh.
But he drew it back when he thought the white man was going to come over and assault him. So Felix told Private Smith that his boss came flying in and told him to get the hell out of there and not to come back. But Felix told Private Smith that he was going to go back there because that was where his assigned duty was. He did turn up missing the day after that. So I think it's one of those, wait, you mean the FBI didn't run that shit down?
They didn't?
I feel like it's a little suspicious if somebody makes a threat on your life and then the next day you come back to work is the day you go missing. It's also worth mentioning the infantry stable guard duty register is missing pages for the day that Felix went missing and the following day, which were February 12th and 13th.
Does that like show who was on base?
So I had to ask Dave that one because I was like, how important is this? Now he said it's like when the person who's doing like CQ duty or whatever,
I don't know what that is.
I don't know, it's guard duty. I'm not in the military, but he said that they'll jot down like anything of interest of people coming or going, any incidences or all. So the fact that the day he went missing and the day after, that roster's gone completely, I think is interesting.
Well, how many other pages are missing too? Or
That's what I asked, because I was just like, but is it possible somebody was just a piece of shit during that section, that was their job and they failed to do it? Which Dave did like a shrugged shoulders. Yeah. Well, I don't know what the ramifications are of not keeping up with the duty roster, but the shit was missing. Okay, that brings us to September 30th, 1941. James Walters, a colored Alabama Gas Company employee, was interviewed based on statements he had made to Willie Ellison, a colored soldier, regarding a threat to Felix's life by one of his white bosses at the sawmill because he refused to call him sir. Now, Walters claimed he didn't know Felix or where the sawmill was even located. It was just a story he was told, and it was when him and Ellison had discussed the article in the paper when Felix was found murdered, but he emphatically refused that he had mentioned knowing the victim was threatened by anyone. And by he, I mean Ellison. He also stated he didn't know James Williams, another employee of the sawmill who had supposedly witnessed the argument between Felix and the white man. Now, investigators went to talk to James Williams about the incident that he witnessed, that Felix's life being threatened the day before he went missing, right? But James,
he didn't recall.
James wasn't home. Now, his brother, who lived next door to him, told investigators that James worked on Fort Benning during the time Felix disappeared, but he didn't get home usually until after 6 every day. They never went back out to talk to him. He's
What?
potentially an eyewitness to somebody's life being threatened the day before they go missing, and they just do he's not home. Now, I did also ask Dave, as being a former investigator, how many times do you have to go out to check somebody before you can write it off on you didn't follow or you couldn't reach them? And he did say twice.
That's it?
Now, mind you, he wasn't doing murder investigations, but I too did the whole twice, and then you can be like, oh, he tried. But I think that's crazy. They never talked to him. Now, in October, they go to James Hall, Felix's dad, and Felix's grandmother, Sarah Hall, were interviewed. Now, Sarah said that Felix's cousin Henry had said that he saw Felix during Christmas vacation drinking with white soldiers at the Silver Moon Cafe in Montgomery. Now, in November, they interview James Davidson, a fellow soldier who was Felix's friend since enlistment and had been aware that Felix went AWOL a week to 10 days before the company left Fort Benning for Fort Devens, Massachusetts. Now, shortly after...
So his company left while he was still missing?
Yes.
Huh.
Now,
right.
Shortly after James arrived at his new post, he heard about Felix's death. He and Felix had hung out a number of times and typically spent the weekends off together. He described Felix as a good person and didn't know anyone who didn't like him or even anyone troubled that Felix, or even knew of any trouble that Felix might have gotten into.
Well, okay, so I don't know how to say this without it sounding fucked up, but you know how when people die, you only want to recognize the good?
Yeah.
But if Felix is potentially the guy that's butting heads with several people that he's working with,
I feel like it doesn't count if it's the white people.
True.
Like, if you can have fellow soldiers be like, I didn't have any issue with him.
Yeah, but if you would think a fellow friend would be like, no, he got along great with people unless they were you know what I mean? Like, I wouldn't think of like, oh, I couldn't think of anybody that wouldn't want to hurt him except for the white people that have been a bunch of freaking racists with this guy.
So
you know what I mean?
Well, James was employed at the timber camp and Felix was at the sawmill. So they didn't work next to, like, they weren't in the same building together when they were working. They just socialized together. So he wouldn't be aware of, like, he wouldn't have witnessed anything that occurred at the sawmill.
No, but he would have you would think if they're friends that he would vent.
Yeah, but he would say he never heard of any trouble at the mill, either with or without Felix. Now, James said they would usually talk about girls, and every now and then one who was a colored girl that worked in Block 12, but he couldn't remember the name. He also said Felix had mentioned having cousins in the military, but he couldn't remember their names either. But he really doesn't recall Felix saying he had gone with a white woman. But I feel like both sides of that one, he might have friends who are like, don't fuck with a white woman kind of scenario.
Yeah.
So I feel like just as she would have wanted to be quiet about it because of the racial tension, I don't feel like he would have advertised it either. Also, they interviewed First Sergeant Frank Williams, who stated he was familiar with Private Hall and was familiar with his habits and considered him an all right individual that he had no trouble with during training exercises, and he was disciplined. And although at times he was more of a kid than a soldier, playing pranks on others, etc., he was always in a jovial mood, and he too did not know of any trouble Felix had been involved in or knew anyone that disliked him. He did not know of any personal relationships he had had. Now, the investigation kind of stalls, not that it's been going real great, but December 7th, 1941, the Japanese attack Pearl Harbor. And then that same month, an amendment of the draft that all men between the ages of 20 and 44 were liable for military service. You know how they extended that?
Mm-hmm. They
extended again to 6 months until the war's over. So basically,
once you're drafted, you're stuck?
Indefinite. They extended the duration of the for the duration of the conflict plus 6 months.
Wow.
So now after Pearl Harbor's attacked, volunteers for enlistments and the draft surged to 10 million, which is a lot of people.
Volunteers?
Between volunteers and the draft, 10 million soldiers are like, that's a lot. Keep in mind, it wasn't much earlier that they only wanted to be training or drafting 900,000 at a time, but definitely a surge of people. So I think part of the half-assery of Felix's investigation is there's a lot of shit going on right now.
Mm-hmm.
You've got racial tension at its highest. Europe's falling to pieces. We're in the throes of a war and training fuck ton of people. So where I think that's a contributing factor to the lack of effort into finding who killed Felix. So February 1942, this is coming a year after his death now. They get around to talking with Felix's cousin, Private Henry Fenderson, and he said the last time he saw Felix was Christmas in 1940 for a few minutes at Shine Dupree's Cafe that was next to the Silver Moon Tavern in Montgomery. Now, Felix had grown up with Private Fenderson, but they saw little of each other after they both had enlisted because they got stationed at different posts. So when they ran into each other on Christmas Eve, he said that they talked briefly, and he didn't recall seeing anyone around Felix other than colored soldiers and civilians. And he stated that Felix was sober, and he didn't recall telling his uncle, which is Felix's dad, and the grandmother, that he was drinking with white soldiers. Now, the FBI does go as far to verify the information with the owner of the Silver Moon Cafe and ask if white soldiers had ever been patrons of his establishment, to which the investigators were informed that white people, soldiers, or civilians had never drank at his place of business. Now, he didn't know Felix personally to be able to give any more information than that, but I think it's interesting that somehow that story had gotten twisted from him telling his aunt and uncle that he ran into Felix. So he's just like, I don't know why they would say he was drinking with white soldiers. I didn't see him drinking with anybody, but I don't remember seeing white soldiers anywhere around.
And apparently didn't see him drinking at all
Yeah, it was weird. Now, in August, Private Kent Durr was interviewed because it was discovered he'd been having a relationship with Sergeant Green's wife. That's why I said, like, dang, this lady. Now, their relationship started after Felix passed, so she found herself another, apparently. But Private Durr stated he had not heard Miss Green make any statements that would lead him to believe that her husband, Sergeant Green, would have any knowledge of the crime. Now, Private Durr had been keeping Miss Green company during the past 9 months while Sergeant Green was in the Panama Canal Zone. Now, with Sergeant Green being back from Panama, he could now be interviewed. He wasn't interviewed while he was in the Panama Canal Zone because the FBI did not have agents in that territory. Now, when Sergeant Green's interviewed, obviously he's going to deny murdering Felix. He did admit to sitting out a time or two on his porch with his .22 rifle, and he also admitted he would tell neighbors that he would kill the peeping Tom for peeping in his windows, but he denied that he'd ever gone off of his porch actively seeking a peeping Tom with a loaded gun. Now, when asked,
but a person strolling by that was possibly loitering, he's going to just shoot random bullets at.
Yeah. Now, when asked what his wife had on him, he said it wasn't what she had on him, but more what he had on her, and spoke of her running around on him with Private Durr while he was away. So it kind of...
That doesn't make sense.
It doesn't.
Because that comment was made
before Private Durr. That's why I said all of this is one of those... How can that be? That was the investigation.
Is Private Durr,
because
is he white or black?
They did not say he was black, and since everybody else
is listed as colored or not,
he's not. But by January 1943, official requests by the Atlanta FBI office are sent to J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI at the time, for permission to dispose of the large exhibits and return other specimens to the provost marshal of Fort Benning to store, since the case is considered closed, as all potential leads were run down and no new information has come to light. To which I did the whole, it's been 2 years. You want to get
all potential leads have been run down? No, you went to one guy's house one time, and then that was it.
It doesn't even sound like they really put the screws to green.
And how do you close an unsolved case? It's not closed. They're like indefinitely open.
Well, I feel like they did the whole, well, we tried. And then like, get this one off the desk. But it's like 2 years. But now with Private Hall's death and other events over the next 7 years where African-American service members were denied equal access, President Truman is convinced to take action. He forms the Civil Rights Commission on July 26, 1948, and directs the full integration of the U.S. Armed Forces. Since that time, the U.S. Army has led the nation in creating an environment for soldiers from all races and backgrounds to serve proudly in defense of our nation. Now, it'll be 80 years after Private Hall's death when Fort Benning creates a memorial for marking where he was last seen.
Wait.
Now, I will tell you, me and Dave took a trip and visited the Infantry Museum on Fort Benning. We also tried real hard to find the memorial for Felix. I don't know if we just really weren't looking very well, but we couldn't find it. So it's not really like, and even the articles where they bring up the fact that Fort Benning did a memorial, they don't say where it's at. They say it's where he was last seen. Well, where the fuck was that?
In the woods, apparently.
Well, they've got a marker apparently in the woods, but they've also got like a placard that says, a memorial to him. But we couldn't find that one. What I thought was really weird, though, when we went on to the Infantry Museum, they don't even talk about Fort Benning being segregated at one time, let alone the fact that when armed forces all like nationwide were forced to fully integrate. So I just think that's a crazy chunk of history to take out. And we're talking about somebody who was part of the infantry's history, but how do you skip over the segregation of the military?
I don't know.
I just thought it was crazy, but that is the murder of Felix Hall. Now, I do want to talk to you a little bit about the Panama Canal, because when I thought it was interesting that when Sergeant Green was stationed at the Panama Canal Zone, I had to look up that one of why that was such a big deal and why they wouldn't just send him back, because you would think being a number one suspect of a murder would be cause to have somebody sent back to the United States.
You would think.
But now the Panama Canal is a 50-mile long man-made canal that cuts through Panama and connects the Pacific Ocean and the Atlantic Ocean. Now, the purpose being that ships can cut through Panama rather than going around South America. Now, the idea of having a canal cut through the land began being mulled over in like 1880, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, from 1881 to 1894, a French entrepreneur worked on building a canal, but the amount of rainfall made construction impossible. He had ended up going bankrupt, and it also cost the lives of 22,000 workers between injury and disease. I promise you, this story has a point. I just thought this was pretty interesting. I know you're going to fall asleep because you don't like my history lessons. But yeah, it is a lot of people. But like 22,000 people died just trying to make that vision a reality. But the Frenchmen decided to seek a buyer for the project because, again, between time and money, it was going out. Now, this is around 1903 that the U.S. is deciding that this is probably a good idea, but they're going to look around to build a spot for their our own canal on our own. But then realize, you know what? It's probably better to take over this project than it would be from starting from scratch, because Panama has some some jungle you'd have to carve through. But at this time, Panama is being controlled by Colombia. So the U.S. begins negotiating and comes to an agreement to lease the area for the U.S. to build the canal. Now, the agreement isn't ratified with Colombia, and later that same year, the Panamanians decide they don't want to be under Colombia's control anymore. So President Teddy Roosevelt decides to go, I'm not going to ratify this agreement with Colombia. I'm going to negotiate with Panama that if the U.S. backs their drive for independence, well, then we can take that opportunity and build our own canal. Now, this agreement was for one payment of $10 million to Panama for a 10-mile wide strip of land for the canal and a guarantee for the Panamanians' independence. Naturally, the Panamanians are like, yeah, let's do that. And Roosevelt sends a U.S. warship to the coast of Panama. The next day, Panama declares their independence on November 3rd, 1903. A side note, the guy that negotiated the treaty for Panama, he wasn't even Panamanian. He was a Frenchman. So I don't know who elected him to be their spokesperson. But anyway, overall, the construction for the Panama Canal took 10 years and $375 million. It's the world's largest man-made lake and also the world's largest dam. It would take 30 hours for a ship to pass through the canal because they have to be lifted and lowered to match the sea level of the Atlantic and the Pacific, which has a difference of 26 meters from coast to coast, making it a serious engineering feat. Now, what all this has to do with anything is we were keeping tabs on the Panama Canal because we were worried that there were spies about. So anybody in the area of the Panama Canal that had a camera, they were arrested for espionage. Now, since this was on the cusp of World War II starting, this is before the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, right? That we were heavily guarding the Panama Canal because the lengths we went to acquire it, to build it, that $375 million to build the thing, we don't want to lose it. And we're also thinking that it could be a potential site that the Japanese bomb. Because if they take that out, then, that would be devastating. But what we also were doing during that time, and I thought was pretty shitty, is when Japanese ships would approach the Panama Canal, we would tell them, oh, no, we're sorry, it's broken, it doesn't work. So we were turning them away. But then you figure you got like allies that were like waving forward, come on, it's fixed for you, we just fixed it. That's what I pictured at least. But I was like, that's you think when they weren't aware of that, if that didn't raise tension of, no, you're not allowed to come through our canal, they are, you're not. So if that didn't raise tension, but that's why the people who were sent to guard, to patrol, to ensure that that was kept, was why I think that they didn't send him back, because they needed the people that they had there. They can't be bothered sending people back and forth because we're concerned about a $370 million investment.
It's quite an investment, especially during that point in time, the whole Great Depression and all that.
Yeah. I just thought it was like some fucked up shit. No, it's broken. And could you imagine like the people looking at each other like, that ship just went through. It just now broke. I'm really surprised nobody bombed the Panama Canal. Like, I don't, not to stoke the fires there, but they know full well they were stirring the pot with that one.
Yes, they do.
But, and I'm not saying that it wasn't a possibility, but I thought it was pretty crazy that if you were Japanese and had a camera and were anywhere near the Panama Canal, your ass went to jail. We even negotiated a spot for Panama to keep said people arrested for espionage, to just put them in jail down there.
And then do what? Just keep them
They
there
didn't
indefinitely?
care. Like, well, that's why I was saying it was just like, what was going on in Panama? But anyway, not to detract from Felix, I think there was a fuck ton of stuff going on, but I really don't feel like a lot of effort was made to find who killed him, because my money is on Green. his neighbor, and his brother-in-law. Those
Yeah.
3 men were nearly 80 pounds heavier than Felix, and I say 3 large men that were drinking during the day could have easily dragged him off. And it would make sense that there were so many ropes, because if they were drunken morons, it would make sense that it was like, that was a little bit too much.
Yeah.
But I thought it was super sad that he was able to get one arm free and his feet free and was trying to dig himself a bank. But since, like, I don't know how much experience you have with clay, but when it's wet, it's almost like quicksand of, like, when it's overly saturated, it's too soft. You're not going to support anything. It just wants to smush out like pudding.
Yeah.
Now, mind you, if it was in a droughty period, it would have been hard as a rock anyway, and he wouldn't have been able to dig it out at all. But I
He
just
was
thought
just
it was so sad that he
fought for his life.
He did. But my theory was that he was diddling Miss Green, as everyone was, and she went missing. I still say Sergeant Green smacked his wife. That's just my belief. Not saying I have any foundation for that theory other than the time frame and him knowing she was sleeping around with everybody. And can you imagine how much more upset he was that she was diddling privates?
Well, you gotta diddle the privates. Get it?
Andrea. I'm not even laughing at that because it wasn't funny.
It was funny.
That's my
It was
theory
funny.
of he was worried when if they're meeting up every night that she doesn't meet up with him, and he's got no way to find out if she's okay other than going and peeping. And
Well,
I do
she
think
doesn't sound like she was a whore, by the way, because so far you've only mentioned 2 possible relationships. One for sure.
So if the neighbors say she's a little better than a prostitute, I'm gonna say that there were more than that. And she shouldn't be sleeping around anyway.
But if the neighbors are helping cover because they find out that she was diddling a black man.
So I don't think the menfolk would have told their wives. And Mrs. Thompson is not.
No, but the menfolk could have referred to her as a whore.
Well, if
because
the
they found out. Huh?
If the shoe fits.
Yeah.
She didn't grieve him for too long that she was diddling somebody else. Like, would that not be tragic if you were, not saying you have, but if you were sleeping around and then your husband killed your boyfriend by lynching him in the woods? Like, would that not be a little bit devastating? I mean,
yeah.
But I still say that, what are the odds she was in a car accident? I think that would have been easy for the FBI to run down. Was Miss Green actually in a car accident? Which car? Let's see the car. Because let's face it, on post, she wouldn't have been going that fast. And she was hospitalized for several days. He whooped her ass is what happened.
Probably.
But I think he went to check on his lady fair, and those 2 had been drinking all day and were outside and dove on him. Now, there is a possibility he was just walking through. He was not diddling Miss Green, and he was just walking through, and these fuckers are drunk as skunks and decide to take out all their manliness on poor, unsuspecting Felix, who is just trying to go to the PX.
Yeah.
I think that's also a possibility. I also think it's a possibility there were no peeping Toms on post. That's why nobody actually officially said there was a peeping Tom. I think that it could have been the white folk were upset at having a colored man walk through their neighborhood. So they were all whispering about, you seen that peeping Tom? Yeah, I think it kind of reminds me of the Salem witch trials of people just running their mouths.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So I think it's possible Felix was doing what he should have been doing, and he is a victim of some heavy Southern racism.
Was the PX on his route from where his body was found?
Yes.
Was that the only route that he could have taken, like the shortest one? Cutting through? So it's entirely possible that he wasn't diddling the whore. He was just
walking home like he normally does.
Yeah.
Which is why I was saying that they couldn't say whose house he was peeping into, because he wasn't peeping. But I think it's weird that he's got a girl in his notebook and Amy without an address and without a last name.
Yeah.
Yeah. So My money's on Green did it. Green did it, and he's not going to have his brother-in-law snitch on him. And I think that the fact that after this all happens, that Sergeant Hodge moves out of that house.
Mm-hmm.
Not where that could be coincidence, because you don't stay on post forever. But I think it was probably an idea of split up. But
Well,
I do
thanks for
think
that
it
case.
was, yeah, it was a half-ass
Washington.
effort. Yes, thank you, Miss Washington.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode of Homicide Hobbies. If we made you laugh, if we made you cry, or if we mind-fucked you for the day, then we thank you for listening. Please write a review on whatever you're listening to us on. Tell your friends, tell your family, tell your coworkers. We're freaking awesome. And join us next week for another episode of Homicide Hobbies. I'm Andy.
And I'm Claire.
That's all we've got.